As someone with Jamar Chase, I am officially screwed this week. But nonetheless, we have to start receivers regardless. Tier 1, you already know. Yeah, you start Jefferson, St. Brown, A.J. Brown. Nothing to talk about. Tier 2, maybe we can have some conversations here. Nico Collins, very disappointing his first week back against Dallas. They told us he was going to be 100%. Now, what 100% meant in the first 4 weeks of the season was 80, 84, 82, 84% of the snaps. What 100% means in week 11 is 47% of the snaps. So definitely super frustrating, but nonetheless, I think that you should expect Nico to be on the field more. Obviously, if it wasn't for the play that was called back, Nico would have absolutely crushed regardless. Matchup against Tennessee, the only concern is, hell, it's probably a spot where they can run the ball consistently. Going over to Kupp and Puka, obviously the Philadelphia Eagles are able to shut down opposing wide receiver ones. Now, thing is, I don't know if we have a shadowed situation. I don't know if you can shadow either Kupp or Puka when they're both in the same offense. And while it's definitely a tough matchup going up against Philly, both receivers realistically are in a range where you start them every single week regardless. I mean, if you're looking at over the past month, Puka, outside of the game he gets thrown out in, has 18, 18, 25 points. Cooper Kupp, 16, 21, 15, 28. So it's a tough matchup, but you start the guys regardless. Mike Evans, obviously, will have to continue to monitor the injury reports that you have. I'll be live streaming every single night. I'll be letting you know exactly how we update these rankings as the week goes on. But as it stands, if Evans is good to go this week, which I think that there is a possibility of, I'm going to be starting him first week back in. Very, very little hesitation, if any, where you have no Godwin. So we should assume that he soaks up the vast majority of targets. And I wouldn't be surprised if we get the second game this season with double-digit targets. With Malik Neighbors, yes, you have no Daniel Jones. I don't particularly know if that's a super bad thing. If you look at the implied team total, right now sportsbooks are putting the Giants at about 18.5 points, which ultimately at the end of the day is what we had previously seen. They are heavy dogs in this matchup as well, 5.5, 6-point dogs. So they're probably forced to throw the ball in the second half. Now going down to our next tier, we're going to be led off with DK Metcalf. Metcalf has a fine day against San Francisco with 14 fantasy points. Ultimately, he's overshadowed, of course, where Jackson Smith-Njigba absolutely goes off. We'll talk about him in just 1 second. Going over to Terry McLaurin. Terry McLaurin last Thursday got shut down. 2-point Terry. Now, of course, I played against Terry McLaurin last week, so I think a big reason for this is, hell, y'all know I know how to scheme up fantasy football defense. But besides that, it was a really tough matchup going up against the Eagles, of course. If you take a step backwards and you actually look at what you had weeks 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, you had only one performance in that entire stretch of games with fewer than 15 points. So I think McLaurin should be super consistent. Right now, sportsbooks are projecting the Commanders to be the second highest scoring offense in the NFL this week, only behind the Detroit Lions. Now, of course, they're going to be able to run the ball a ton against Dallas. And with CeeDee Lamb next, Lamb still remains an absolute must-start wide receiver every single week based off volume. Last 5 games he's played, you've had 14, 17, 12, 10, and 12 targets. Now, obviously, the touchdown upside's not going to be there because you have Cooper Rush under center rather than Dak Prescott. So again, want to reiterate, Lamb is no longer a tier 1 receiver for us. Instead, he's a low-end wide receiver 1 that's going to get there based off the volume. George Pickens will be our next option. Obviously, we are extremely high on Pickens in the rankings last week as well. Big thing was you had a really good matchup going up against Baltimore. To be honest with you, I'm a little bit more nervous about George Pickens this week going up against the Cleveland Browns. You have an over-under in this game of about 36 points, so it should be one of the lower scoring contests in the NFL this week, if not the lowest scoring game. If you look at George Pickens' underdog pick'em for Thursday night, they have him higher, lower, I want to say 58.5 receiving yards. So obviously, if you think I'm wrong here, you think Pickens is going to crush, where every game that he has played with Russell Wilson, he has greatly exceeded 58 receiving yards. You can find that pick over on Underdog Fantasy. I'll leave the link in the description as well as the comment section. If you use code FLOCK, you'll get a 50% deposit bonus up to $1,000. Plus, you'll get a free Jameis Winston pick, more than less than half a total yard for that Thursday night game. And you'll be getting a free team review in the live stream we're doing every night. Now, going over to Marvin Harrison Jr., we have not had a single game with double-digit targets since back against the Detroit Lions in week 3. Now, with that being said, it's a really good game environment going up against the Seattle Seahawks. Obviously, Harrison, over the past month, you've seen the boom bust nature where you get the 5 points, then the 23 points, the 3 points, then the 16 points. Really has been touchdown dependent. But also, a lot of these games over the past month, you've actually had the Arizona Cardinals blowing out their opponents and able to run the ball in the second half. It's probably not a spot where they can do that against Seattle this week, where currently they are point underdogs. Now, going over to our next tier, Jackson Smith-Njigba continues to climb higher and higher and higher in these rankings. JSN has played 4 games this season where he's had double-digit targets. If you look at 2 weeks ago or 2 games ago against the Los Angeles Rams, obviously gives you one of the best performances from any wide receiver so far this season with the 37 fantasy points off of 13 targets, 180 receiving yards, and multiple receiving touchdowns. Again, I was really hesitant to just go buy all in to that performance because you had no DK Metcalf in that game. However, against the San Francisco 49ers, JSN this past week leads Seattle in targets, receptions, and receiving yards. And it's very different with JSN versus Cedric Tillman. Where obviously I know Cedric Tillman has the blow-up games. Everybody in the comment section wants to scream at me how stupid I am not to immediately rank him as a must-start wide receiver. Where I'm always hesitant is with those wide receivers that pop off, that have no pedigree, that really have no background, and are projecting out to be in bad offenses going into the future. And that's why I'm not really going to be willing to go all in on a player like Cedric Tillman. However, with Jackson Smith-Njigba, it's a very different story. This was a wide receiver that we loved coming into the NFL draft last year. He gets the round 1 draft capital associated with him. He was a phenomenal prospect, and then you have the breakout in year 2. This is the story that you buy into, where you have the larger sample of the collegiate dominance of the NFL draft capital, and we see the season-long outlook with the target share in his offense. So this is why I'm a lot more willing to view that JSN caliber player as a must-start option at this point, really just off a handful of blow-up performances in comparison to that Cedric Tillman type character from last week, where I know everybody was upset with us with those ranks. Ladd McConkey, you're kind of getting confirmation as well. This is a receiver that went inside the top 40 picks in the NFL draft this past season. I mean, pretty much every week this year, he's been at the very top of the target totem pole for the Los Angeles Chargers. The issue is a lot of these Chargers games, the Chargers have been able to just really limit the passing volume that you have from Herbert, limit the amount of dropbacks that he has, and really just run the ball over and over and over again and play great defense. And yeah, you can do that when you go up against Cleveland. You can do that when you go up against Tennessee. You can do that when you go up against Carolina, when you go up against the Raiders. But obviously, as you get to these opponents like the Cincinnati Bengals last week, as you get to the Baltimore Ravens this week, where you're actually 3-point dogs, this is probably a spot where you actually have to ask Justin Herbert to up the amount of dropbacks you see, where you actually can get some passing volume in this offense going in the direction of Ladd McConkey. You had the 9 targets last week, the 123 receiving yards, looks great. Courtland Sutton looks great as well. I mean, you had the goose egg back against the New Orleans Saints, but since then, he's averaged almost 10 targets a game. Since then, he's averaged about 17 fantasy points per contest as well, actually up closer to 18, 19 fantasy points per game. And he's been great. This hasn't just been off of touchdown volume. He's only had 1 touchdown over the past 40 targets. So this is off volume. Bo Nix looks like he's improving every single week. It's a good matchup going up against the Raiders. Obviously, the concern that you would have here is that Denver can just effectively run the ball, since the Raiders shouldn't be able to put points up on the board. But Sutton looks like an absolute must-start wide receiver the way that Bo Nix is playing. I'm going over to Jaden Reed. I'm sorry. I'm going to continue to quote-unquote disrespect Reed. I honestly want to have him lower than this. The thing with Reed, and I know we've been saying this all season, and he freaking gets there every single week. The man doesn't draw targets. You go through and look at the year, he's had 1 game with more than 6 targets. Now, of course, this past week, he saves it with a touchdown. 2 weeks ago, he saves it because he has 113 receiving yards off of only 5 receptions. But this efficiency can't keep up through the entire year. It should be a very high-scoring game going up against the Niners. It projects to be one of the highest-scoring games in the NFL this week. But honestly, I want to rank Reed lower than this. In our flex ranks, he may be. Going over to DeAndre Hopkins. Hopkins super disappointing against Buffalo, kind of disappointing against Denver as well, but it was two really tough matchups. You had an implied team total for the Kansas City Chiefs this past week. I want to say at about 21.5 points. This week, that's back up to almost 27 points against the Carolina Panthers. Obviously, the assumption would be with this game having an 11, 12-point spread that the Chiefs run the ball over and over and over again, but it should be a spot where they're able to put points up on the board very easily. And Hopkins, I do want to say, is the number one target earner here. To be honest, when we update these with the flex rankings later, or if you check out flockfantasy.com right now, we're probably going to move Reed and Hopkins below Flowers, Smith, and Debo. I'm looking at, say, Flowers 3 straight weeks with only 6 targets, but off of a total of 18 targets, he has 3 touchdowns, so the touchdown rate has been absolutely insane. With Flowers, it's a tougher matchup going up against Los Angeles on paper, where the Chargers have a great defense. But the reality of the situation is the Baltimore projects out really nicely in this game with an implied team total of 27 points. I'm looking at Devonta Smith. I'll be starting him in the Flock League this week. I'm really hoping that he's better than this. It's a great matchup against the Rams. The issue is, if you look at what you've had since the concussion, you've seen only 1 game with more than 6 targets. And we have seen 3 games with fewer than 5 targets. Now, obviously, he was getting there with touchdowns earlier, but that unsustainable touchdown rate can't last forever, and you're seeing it catch up to him now. And then looking at Deebo Samuel, to be completely honest with you, I'm going to move Deebo up the rankings. I think we move Reed and Hopkins to the very bottom end of this tier. I still would start Deebo Samuel if I have him. I mean, it looks like we were very much wrong to assume that he was just the locked and loaded wide receiver one in this offense once he had the Brandon Ayuk injury. And the concern now is not only is Jennings seeing all the target volume, but at the same time, you may get Kittle back into this offense and competition will rise. And honestly, this is, I think, the lowest we have seen the Niners project out offensively all season with an implied team total of only 22.5 points. Going over to Josh Downs, the Colts are 8-point dogs here going up against the Detroit Lions. They probably will get stomped on. Downs, again, has been incredible this season. A lot of these games were with Joe Flacco, so a lot of them you can kind of throw out the window. But even in the games with Anthony Richardson, the last 2 performances have been 19 points, 22 points. Still, when you have an offense that projects to have just an incredibly low mark with the passing volume, both with yards and touchdowns, it's very difficult to give wide receivers in fantasy a ton of credit. But I do need to give everybody a ton of credit that drafted Josh Downs in underdog drafts this year. Like, looking back, hindsight being 2020, from a process perspective, y'all nailed it. Probably one of the best draft picks this season. Downs has been incredible in a bad situation. Literally could not imagine what he would look like in a great spot. I will say, well, of course, he had all the points this past week. You actually did get Michael Pittman Jr. with the majority of targets, so that is something to point out here. I'm going over to Juwan Jennings. Jennings has been dominant since he's come back from injury, since you've had no Brandon Ayuk. You've seen 16 and 25 fantasy points over the past 2 weeks. You've seen 11 targets in each of the 2 games. And this isn't the first time we've seen this. You go back to week 3, remember you had the 46-point blow up for Jennings. So Jennings looks great. I think a lot of people would be willing to rank him right now as the wide receiver 1 in San Francisco. I may be a little bit hesitant with it just because we have the years of data points when it comes to Deebo Samuel in comparison to a couple games of data points when it comes to Juwan Jennings. But I mean, another performance from Jennings here against Green Bay, similar to what you saw against Tampa or Seattle. Jennings will flip Deebo in these rankings. Calvin Ridley will be the next option. With Ridley, again, garbage offense, implied team total only 16.5 points, but massive spread. They're probably going to have to throw the ball a ton, and ultimately, Calvin Ridley just gets every single target in this offense. DJ Moore in a very bad offense as well. Obviously, Caleb looks much better with the change with the offensive coordinator. At least he did against the Green Bay Packers. This week, you have an implied team total of only 18 points here for Chicago. So, of course, it should be a lower scoring offense in general. But if there was going to be anybody who would score points in this offense, it would more likely than not be the receivers rather than the running backs. Jacoby Myers, garbage offense, not only a garbage offense, but probably the worst spot you could be in if you're a wide receiver 1 going up against the Denver Broncos. Jamison Williams, we know who he is. He's in the best offense in the league. He's not going to see a lot of target volume. If the long receiving touchdown's there, Jamison Williams is going to be great. If the long receiving touchdown's not there, he won't be. But again, you have an implied team total of 29.5 points. So ultimately, this is the best offense in the league. And this is probably the best offense he could possibly be in for his role. Tank Dell will be the next option. I mean, with Dell, you do see the target volume go down against the Dallas Cowboys with only 7 targets. And again, I want to reiterate, he had a large stretch of games with no Nico Collins where he still wasn't viable. So I don't see how you can trust him here. I know a lot of people are maybe going to get suckered into Cedric Tillman, Jerry Jeudy this week, and maybe one of them go off. But again, if you look at the target distribution here in Cleveland, Elijah Moore, Jeudy, and Tillman are all seeing about the same amount of looks. And this is currently projected out to be the second worst offense in the NFL, only ahead of the Carolina Panthers in what is a really tough matchup against the Steelers on Thursday night. So I know some people maybe want to feel something and they want to just throw a Thursday night guy in the flex spot just to have some fun, but I would avoid Tillman and Jeudy if I could this week. Jordan Addison, I took in a bunch of underdog drafts. I feel like an idiot for doing so. The guy is 100% a touchdown or bust option, and obviously in comparison to Jameson Williams in a much better offense, you'd way rather the touchdown or bust option in Detroit, who has a bigger play upside as well. Going over to Rome Odunze, with Rome, 100% trending in the right direction. I mean, we called him that buy low candidate coming out of his bye week. Just thinking, oh, okay, well, you're going to see more Rome after the bye. We know rookie wide receivers tend to trend in the right direction when it comes to their target share as the season goes on, which actually has happened if you look at Rome Odunze. This is a receiver that's averaging about 7-8 targets a game since the bye week. But again, the issue is just the offense isn't anything close to being able to start really anybody here. I stand by DJ Moore is probably the wide receiver one for the time being, but definitely getting closer. Xavier Worthy, touchdown or bust option, going up against the Carolina Panthers. Probably a spot where the Chiefs don't have to throw the ball a ton. Jalen Waddle, honestly, should be even lower than this. I have Waddle in the Flock League. He sits there on my bench, and I look at our sweet young prince every single night before I go to bed. But realistically, I don't know how you could ever get him in your starting lineup. Like, if somebody told me that they cut Waddle, while I wouldn't do it, I completely understand it. I mean, if you're looking at the past 5 weeks, Waddle is sitting here with a total of 19 targets. Yes, he's averaging fewer than 4 targets a game since the bye. Keenan Allen has had 1 game with double-digit fantasy points. He does have a considerable amount of target volume, but again, it's a bad offense. Michael Pittman Jr. leads the team in targets against the Jets this past week, but ultimately doesn't matter. Downs is the wide receiver one, and it's a bad offense. Christian Watson blows up with 150 receiving yards. It's his 3rd game this season with double-digit fantasy points, but he had 4 targets. He's had 1 game with more than 6 targets this season. Going over to Quentin Johnston. This is a receiver that, honestly, I would like to have higher than this. Y'all know I took him to a bunch of underdog drafts, and it looks really good at this point. One of the reasons we are crushing in all our underdog tournaments at the moment. But it's just super unsustainable what he's doing right now. Like, if you're looking at Quentin Johnston, the man is sitting with 6 total touchdowns. And I mean, if you're looking at just what we've had in the last 4 games here, the target volume has come up just a bit, but still at the same time, it's only 19 targets. He's averaging lower than 4 targets a game. So it's very hard to get in. It should be a decent matchup going up against Baltimore. But I think that's all I got for you. I really hope I was able to help you out in some way here. And of course, if you wanted to go say, Mason, you're an idiot, Cedric Tillman's going to crush, by all means, go take the higher than 42.5 receiving yards on Underdog Fantasy. I think it's a tough matchup, so I'll probably avoid it. But if you wanted that, you could find the link in the description, comment section, promo code FLOCK. You'll get a 50% deposit bonus up to $1,000. Plus, you'll be getting that free Jameis Winston pick, more than less than half a total yard for Thursday night. And you'll be getting a free team review in the live stream we're doing every single night as well. Just make sure you set up an account on flockfantasy.com with the same email address as your Underdog Fantasy account. That way we can accredit you with that free team review voucher. But thank you again. I really appreciate you and really hope we get to see you out in the live stream tomorrow night.